Hi everyone, it's me Lina again. Thank you a lot for checking my videos out. I hope you're doing fine. And today in this video I'd like to discuss cultural differences between England and Ukraine. I actually noticed quite a few things myself and I really felt like sharing with you. First thing that I noticed is the way people cross roads. So here people cross the roads very differently. Quite often they ignore lights, like they can cross when it's a red light and so on. Quite often people ignore crossing and so on. So in Ukraine it wouldn't be like that at all. You're supposed to cross the road when it's a green light, of course, and it's better if you actually cross the road where there is a crossing. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's actually the rule that if there is crossing, you're supposed to cross there. To be fair, I used to actually follow those rules because it just made me feel so much more confident and like better, and I wouldn't be as afraid that some car's gonna chase me or anything like that. So I do prefer the way it is in Ukraine because you just don't have to be as scared, and sometimes I'm scared crossing roads here, especially if the road is very busy and when my husband is trying to cross the road where there is no crossing or no lights or anything like that. I also lived in Poland for a while, and rules there are very similar to how it is in Ukraine. You're supposed to cross only where there is crossing, when it's a green light and so on. And I like those rules. You can also get fined in Poland if you're crossing the road in the wrong place, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in Ukraine. And I remember when I was like back from Poland to Ukraine, I actually witnessed when someone got fined because of the way they were crossing the road. Sometimes I'm really anxious about crossing roads here. It just can be really nerve-wracking. So another thing that I noticed to be quite different here in England, or at least in London, the way people refer to strangers as love or doll. I kind of like it, but honestly for Ukrainians, for most Ukrainians, it would sound very bizarre, and I'm sure it does, first times they hear it. If someone would refer to you as love in Ukraine, you would probably assume that they are flirting. So it is not the case in England, and it's kind of beautiful, but it is very different. Honestly, when someone says my darling, perhaps it's not as, as bizarre as when someone says like love or doll, but yeah, it's still quite interesting and very different. For me personally, it is not that strange because I'm just so used to watch so many Western TV shows and movies. So another thing that is pretty different is the fact that here in England I noticed that many people tend to eat seafood together with meat, or well, sausage for that matter. So perhaps not really meat, but sausage. I noticed that there is this dish that contains chorizo and scallops together, and in Ukraine it wouldn't be the case at all, especially if it is some sort of fancy parties that you are throwing. You wouldn't really serve any meat together with seafood or fish because it is sort of considered to be faux pas in Ukraine. And if it's fine dining, or if it's some fancy party at your house, for example, yeah, you wouldn't really serve that type of things together. Yeah, it would consider to be really bizarre rather, but of course some people might still eat it. I'm not saying no one eats it like that in Ukraine. I also feel like this is some Spanish influence to, let's say, English cuisine. I'm not sure though if I'm right, so perhaps I'm totally wrong. This is what I would assume. Another difference is museums and the way they are here in England. So most museums are free, which is incredible and honestly something that is really great. I think it is cool that lots of people just can go to museum, educate themselves and see lots of beautiful and valuable art. And it is definitely something that is just so right. We actually have lots of interesting museums in Ukraine too, but most of them you would have to pay for, you would have to buy a ticket basically. And another thing about museums, by the way, here in England, is that lots of them have like little cafes inside basically. And I find it to be super cool because I'm personally quite a foodie. I guess I share this love to food with English people. Perhaps I shouldn't generalize, but well, I guess most people like it because, there wouldn't be cafes. Lots of people probably feel like they can have a break to eat something, you know, in between, like walking through museum and so on, which is pretty cool. I find it to be really nice, and the first time I actually noticed it, I was like so impressed. I've been telling everyone about it when I first came to England. I later like went back to Ukraine, and I was telling my friends, my family about it. So another thing that I find to be pretty, well, strange, at least I found it strange when I just arrived to England, like to live here, was the fact that lots of people don't wear much clothes when it's really cold. For me it was so bizarre because I would get cold. And I noticed in March when I arrived that, for example, some lady was wearing like the shoes in which your toes are exposed, well, her toes in that situation, obviously. And honestly, I was like, oh my god, because I was wearing all the winter clothes still, and I found it to be quite bizarre back then, at least. And my husband told me another stories where, you know, people in England, or well, in London, let's say, lots of people tend to wear like not that much clothes, for example, when they go clubbing. And the thing is, it's not about how much clothes they wear, it's just that it's cold. To be fair, I actually admire this. I sort of feel like people who live in England tend to expose themselves to colder weather much more even than we Ukrainians. And I think that it is actually a good thing because they sort of keep themselves healthy, but they don't have this sort of a habit to, you know, wear too much clothes in winter, and I think it actually makes them healthier. I feel like Ukrainians are being over dramatic with like cold weather. From what I see here, sometimes it can be minus like 3, and people don't seem to be over dramatic with like how much clothes they're gonna wear. And honestly, I think it is something right. There is some, you know, wisdom in it. Actually, something I want to mention also, I feel like when you constantly keep yourself too warm, like you don't expose yourself to cold weather and so on, you kind of get used to be warm, and whenever there is just a little bit of wind, you tend to catch cold much more easier. I actually noticed it about myself. This is why I decided to expose myself to cold weather more. I felt like I was keeping myself in very warm temperature, and now I'm like very sensitive to cold weather. Also, another thing that I noticed is some little details in like all the houses. For example, here where we live, in this building, like in the bathrooms, there is this sort of like round thing in the window that is like made of plastic, and it sort of like moves or turns when there is a wind, and it's very interesting. So my husband suggests that this is because winters used to be like colder, and basically windows were not open for a while, like people wouldn't open windows, and it is to let the air come like inside. So I find it to be quite smart actually, and very different. I haven't seen anything like that before. In Ukraine we actually have lots of beautiful buildings that are absolutely beautiful. My grandpa actually used to live in this beautiful old building, but I didn't notice anything like that in Ukraine, so it is quite different. So another thing is transport in Ukraine and in England. They're just very different. So here in London, obviously there are those double-decker buses that are just so big compared to some buses in Ukraine. They're just so tiny, and some of them are really old. We have lots of new ones actually, but still some are very, very tiny, and my husband pointed it out when he was visiting Ukraine. And also in Ukraine we have trolley buses, which are just so interesting. They have overhead power lines, so it sort of limits them in the way they move. In London there are DLR trains, of course tube. Of course we have tube in Ukraine in big cities. There are also different trains. In Ukraine we got trains that are for long distant areas. As you probably know, or perhaps you don't know, Ukraine is actually not that small, so sometimes you have to travel quite a distance from one city to another. And we basically have those trains that are like these little rooms that you can close and you can sleep and so on. Maybe they got it here too, but I don't know. From the way my husband talked about it, about trains in Ukraine, it looks like they are not popular or that they don't have it here. So architecture in Ukraine and England are quite different too. So in Ukraine, lots of people tend to enclose their balconies or verandas, especially in the multi-story buildings. and honestly it just looks absolutely horrible and terrible. And I'm so glad that now in Ukraine we have laws that just don't allow those. It's because those people were making those buildings look very horrible just to make themselves comfortable and to make more space for themselves. Also in Ukraine there are Soviet-style buildings, like multi-story buildings, and in my opinion they also look very depressing and just not beautiful at all. But then I don't want to concentrate attention only on bad architecture like that. There are lots of beautiful buildings. If you would visit Lviv or Odessa, you would see that there are lots of beautiful architecture. So there is something kind of funny and something that England and Ukraine sort of have in common. It is their love to pharmacies and drugstores. In the city where I'm from, there is pharmacy like every 5 meters from each other on the streets. It is because pharmacy business is like very, let's say, successful. I notice in England people love their drugstores and pharmacies too, so it is quite similar. So there is something that my husband noticed about Ukraine. I didn't really notice it, to be fair, but he pointed it out to me, and now I kind of understand what he's talking about. So it is the fact that Ukrainian men, they love to wear short haircuts, army style. Of course not everyone, and there are men with long hair and so on, so it's not like everyone does that, but it's sort of very visible when you come from London to, for example, city I'm from. At least this is something that my husband saw straightforward and was talking about it, was curious about it. So those men are not forced to wear the type of hairstyle. It is probably something cultural and they just like it. There are no limits in haircuts whatsoever, and everyone can wear haircuts they like. So another thing that England and Ukraine has in common, it is love to theater. In Ukraine, people absolutely love going to theater. Not everyone, of course, does, but yeah, they do like it. And also quite often students like from school are taken to theaters, sometimes to different plays that have some like meaning, or they are sort of like in a school program. So it's sort of curious. I sort of like theater myself, so yeah. Also, taxis or cabs are quite different. In Ukraine, cab can be different type of car, so it doesn't really matter. Another thing that is quite curious about Ukraine is that lots of companies communicate with people through Viber. It is very common to have like conversations and to send details about your order and so on through Viber, which is fine by me. So, delivery service. Delivery service in Ukraine is much better than in England. For example, when you're about to receive some delivery, courier or delivery person would call you, they would set the time with you, or they would book the time with you. So everything is very precise. While in England, they can just leave it somewhere, hanging outside, and they wouldn't really care much because, for example, it's not as valuable and so on. So in Ukraine, no one does that, and quite often you can even pay after you receive the parcel. I'd say in this part, Ukraine is much more developed, and I like how delivery service in Ukraine is. Another thing that is quite curious is that in Ukraine, it's quite common to see that people are selling hand-picked fruits. Quite often, some older people would do that. People who live close to the forest, for example, or people who have their own little farm. I'm not sure if it's the right word to say, but people who basically grow those, for example, berries. It can be berries, fruits, or anything like that. In England, you don't see really things like that, which is understandable actually. So yeah, makes sense. I feel like selling hand-picked fruits or berries doesn't exactly come from like good situation. I feel like people are doing that in Ukraine because they're lacking money, and it is quite sad. So another thing in Ukraine that is quite curious is, for example, that there are actually horses pulling carriages. It is actually quite beautiful because carriages look quite beautiful and nice, and it sort of adds some sort of romantic vibe, I would say, to the city. Quite often you can see stuff like that in Lviv, for example. It's beautiful, but I think that horses need to be treated well, so I hope that they are. So churches in England and Ukraine are very different. In Ukraine, inside they're usually very colorful and there are lots of religious paintings. They can actually look quite bright too, like in bright colors and stuff like that. My husband said that they do look very beautiful. So another thing that is quite interesting, it is the love of Ukrainians to rugs. I would say that now with years it's like getting way less, meaning that this love sort of disappears, but still some people like rugs on the floor. Some of those rugs are of really great quality, they are quite old. I think it is Oriental influence on Ukraine that people like rugs so much. So also Ukrainians have special traditional clothes, or I would call it national clothes, and usually it looks very beautiful. There are also lots of designers that are working in that direction right now, creating beautiful Ukrainian traditional clothes or clothes that is influenced by Ukrainian traditional clothes. Some of it is very expensive. I guess it depends where you are getting it from. Quite often lots of details of Ukrainian traditional clothes is handmade, so yeah, people put lots of work in it. In general, I would say that Ukrainians are very hardworking. Of course, not everyone. I mean, there are different people. If I were to generalize, I would say that they are. Another thing about England, that there is royal family, which is, I would say, like a symbol, some sort of. As you know, in this time in Ukraine we don't have royal family, so yeah, it is quite a difference. Another thing that I'd like to mention is the gap year in universities in England. Apparently it is very popular to take a gap year. So in Ukraine you can sort of do that type of thing. I'm not sure if it is exactly same thing, but I know it is possible to take that break from university. No one really does that, but apparently in UK it is very popular to take a gap year, which in Ukraine someone would consider to do so only if there is some sort of emergency and so on. Another thing that I want to talk about are washing machines. So in Ukraine, every family would have washing machine. It is actually a necessity and no one would go somewhere else to wash their clothes. Like, I know that type of practice is still popular in US. So apparently in UK there are still, like, I don't know how they're called, shops with washing machines where you wash your clothes. You pay for it. Well, you sort of, I think, like use coins. So in Ukraine we don't have it, never did. I have never heard of anything like that in Ukraine. Another thing that I feel like I should mention is the roads quality. I don't want to say that in England roads are much better. Probably they are. Though recently roads in Ukraine have been improved very much and drastically. They are much better now. Though there is something similar that Ukraine and England actually share. So it is the drains for water, like for rain on roads. Apparently both in Ukraine and in England they are very small. Like my husband said that in Australia they are like much bigger, and here in England those drains struggle to collect all the water, all the rain, and in Ukraine there is the same situation. Sometimes it blocks very easily. We do have heavily rains too, so it is something that Ukraine and England has in common, those tiny drains for like water. Another thing is wildlife. Here in London you can see foxes hanging around the streets, which you would never ever see in Ukraine. We have some squirrels in park and they do have lots of squirrels here in London, but foxes is just so bizarre. When I first saw fox I was quite shocked. Apparently it's because there are not enough woods for those animals to live in, or the place where they lived, it was like taken over basically by human. I don't know if it's something good, probably not, but it is the way it is. Also, another thing that my husband told me is that apparently here, when you drive and you see that someone else hit the wild pig, you can take that pig home basically. As it comes to hunting, there is some hunting in Ukraine, as I believe, but there are lots of animals that are in red books, so you are not allowed to hunt for certain type of animals. Probably it's like that here too. Honestly, I haven't really gone for hunting, so I don't know that much about it. Another thing in Ukraine that is quite interesting is the fact that we would call a person that is older, or our boss, for example, or our teacher, we would call them by their first name and also the name of their father. I'm not sure if it's still a common practice in school. I actually have to ask my friend who's a teacher, but I believe so. And when I was studying in school, it was still like that, and it is quite interesting. I think it's something that you would be probably curious about if you don't know much about Ukraine. I have the feeling that it is also some sort of Oriental influence on our culture. But yeah, in fact, we would call teacher by their first name and we would add like the name of their father. I'm not sure how else to explain it. Anyways, if you'd like me to make more videos like this one, let me know. And don't forget to like this video, because I don't usually film that type of videos, so it is important for me to know if you actually like that sort of things. Anyways, if you have some questions to ask, I'll be glad to answer them as soon as possible. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, give this video some thumbs, and I'll see you soon.